It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it. The yacht owner laughed as the massive hull crushed the veteran's boat. No one helped. No one apologized. The American flag on the sun-bleached vessel drifted into the harbor. Torn, but the next morning the entire harbor turned silent as 6 Navy ships pulled in without a word, their flags lowered to half-mast. Who were they saluting? And why had the sea suddenly remembered one forgotten man? Still believe that good deeds come full circle? Share your thoughts. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Edward Hale, 72, had lived a quiet life in Harborside for decades. Most mornings found him on the water before dawn, his weathered hands guiding the wooden boat he'd lovingly built after returning from service. In a coastal town increasingly dominated by luxury and tourism, he was a living relic, respected by some, invisible to most. His vessel, Liberty Child, wasn't much to look at. The paint had faded under 40 years of salt and sun, and the wooden hull showed its age in every creak and groan. But it was sturdy, built by a man who understood that beauty often lies beneath the surface. Edward had crafted it plank by plank after returning from Vietnam, using the rhythmic work to quiet the memories that followed him home from the sea. The locals knew little about his service record. Edward wasn't one to speak of such things. They knew only that he'd been Navy, and that he sometimes woke screaming in the night, sounds that carried across the water on still evenings when he slept aboard his boat. That Wednesday morning began like any other. Edward had set out at 5 a.m., planning to check his crab pots and watch the sunrise from his spot near the harbor mouth. He'd just finished securing his mooring when he heard the deep throb of powerful engines. The La Vita came around the harbor bend like a gleaming white mountain, 600 tons of Italian-designed luxury, cutting through the water with entitled confidence. At the helm stood Colin Mercer, a 38-year-old tech entrepreneur who'd recently purchased the town's largest beachfront property. Edward recognized him from the local papers, which had celebrated his arrival as an economic blessing for the struggling community. Edward waved his arms, signaling his position. The yacht showed no signs of slowing. "Hey, I'm moored here," he called, his voice lost in the yacht's engine noise. On the upper deck, Mercer and his guests raised champagne flutes, laughing at some private joke, oblivious or indifferent to the small wooden boat in their path. The harbor's security boat bobbed nearby, its officer watching with apprehension but making no move to intervene. The impact came with a sickening crunch. Liberty Child's stern splintered under the yacht's bow, the wood no match for steel and fiberglass. Edward barely managed to jump clear, landing hard on the dock as his boat, his creation, his sanctuary, broke apart beneath the larger vessel. The American flag he'd flown every day for 40 years tore free, falling into the churning water, its red stripes bleeding into the foam. The engines finally cut. In the sudden silence, Mercer's annoyed voice carried clearly across the water. "It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it." Edward stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting. Around him a crowd had gathered, morning joggers, dock workers, tourists with phones raised. Not one step forward to help. The harbor's security officer approached reluctantly. "Mr. Hale, I'll need to file a report." But Edward wasn't listening. He'd spotted his flag drifting away, torn and sodden. He limped along the dock, following it until he could reach down with an aching shoulder and pull it from the water. He held the dripping fabric against his chest, cradling it as tenderly as he might have held a fallen comrade. His eyes, when he raised them to the crowd, held neither anger nor accusation, only a quiet dignity that made the onlookers glance away in discomfort. "Nice boat," Mercer called from his deck, the sarcasm cutting through the morning air. "Maybe it's time to upgrade, old time. Everything has its expiration date." Edward said nothing. He simply gathered the soaked flag and turned away, his back straight despite the pain in his joints, his footsteps steady despite the trembling in his hands. Behind him someone laughed. A phone notification pinged, as the first video went online with the caption, "Old man, old boat, old news." By noon the harbor had returned to normal. The broken remnants of Liberty Child had been cleared away, an eyesore removed, a problem solved. People scrolled past the video, most pausing only long enough to type, "Hello," before continuing with their day. No one mentioned the tears that had glistened unshed in an old sailor's eye. Edward's home sat on a small bluff overlooking the harbor, a modest cottage purchased with his Navy pension decades ago, before property values had soared beyond the reach of working people. Through his front window, he'd watched the town transform from a fishing community into a vacation destination. the change as gradual and relentless as the tide. That evening he sat at his kitchen table, a wooden chest opened before him. Inside lay the artifacts of a life of service, faded photographs of young men with serious eyes, commendation letters yellowed with age, dog tags that had once hung against his heart through midnight watches and storm-tossed seas. At the bottom, carefully folded, lay another American flag, this one crisp and pristine, presented to him when he'd retired from active duty. His grandson Daniel, visiting from college, stood in the doorway watching. "You're going to sue them, right, Grandpa? That guy destroyed your boat. He should pay." Edward shook his head slowly, his fingers tracing the embroidered stars on the flag. "He didn't hit me," he said quietly. "He only hit something nobody ever cared about." Daniel frowned, the injustice burning brighter in his young heart than in his grandfather's weathered one. "But you built that boat. It meant something to you." "Yes," Edward agreed. "To me." Later, after Daniel had gone to bed, Edward opened his old logbook. For 40 years he'd recorded the weather, the state of the sea, the catch of the day. Now he wrote simply, "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences offered, but I can still hear the water calling." He closed the book and turned on his small television. The local news was running a story about Mercer's yacht, celebrating it as the largest private vessel to ever dock in Harborside Harbor. There was no mention of the morning's collision. Online, the video had gone viral. Most comments supported the yacht owner. "That old boat was an eyesore anyway. These boomers need to know when to retire. Why not just get with the times and buy a modern boat?" The harbor master had called that afternoon. His voice had been professionally neutral, as he explained. "Your vessel wasn't equipped with radar reflectors or proper navigation lights. It wasn't up to current standards. I'm afraid the insurance company won't cover the loss." Edward had listened silently, then thanked the man and hung up. He hadn't bothered to mention that his boat had been grandfathered under older regulations, or that he'd never missed a safety inspection in 40 years. What was the point? Liberty Child was gone. The sea had taken back what he'd borrowed from it for a time. That was the nature of things. Still, as he stood on his porch that night, looking out over the harbor lights, the absence ached like a phantom limb. It wasn't just wood and canvas he'd lost. It was the quiet mornings watching dolphins play in his wake, the peaceful evenings when the rocking of the boat had soothed his troubled dreams. It was the one place where the war couldn't follow him, where the ocean's rhythm replaced the memories of gunfire and scream. From his vantage point, he could see La Vida lit up like a floating city, music and laughter drifting across the water. Life going on without pause, the rich and carefree celebrating their good fortune while an old man mourned alone. Edward didn't begrudge them their happiness. He'd seen enough suffering to last many lifetimes. He only wished they understood what had been lost, not just a boat, but a connection to something greater, a way of being in the world that valued silence and solitude, that respected the sea instead of conquering it. In the moonlight, he unfolded his retired service flag and draped it over the porch railing, letting the breeze from the ocean caress the fabric once more. At dawn he rose out of habit, reaching for his boat keys before remembering. The hollow feeling in his chest expanded until it seemed to fill the whole room. For the first time in 40 years, he had nowhere to go when the morning star faded. He didn't ask for compensation, he didn't shout, but he deserved one thing: if you believe honor can't be bought, type honor. The morning fog hung thick over Harborside, shrouding the entrance to the harbor in a pearly haze. Edward sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, watching the ghostly curtain that separated land from sea. Since losing Liberty Child, he'd found himself keeping the same hours but with nowhere to go, a sailor stranded on dry land. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when the harbor foghorn sounded, 3 long blasts that vibrated through the morning stillness. Edward straightened, his old instincts recognizing the signal for large vessels entering the harbor. Through the mist, gray shapes emerged, massive and purposeful, cutting through the water with disciplined precision. 6 Navy ships in formation, their outlines sharpening as they approached. No announcements had preceded their arrival, no celebration had been planned. Most striking of all was the silence. No horns, no signals beyond the necessary navigational requirements. On each vessel the American flag flew at half-mast, a gesture of mourning and respect. As word spread, the townspeople gathered along the waterfront. Shop owners flipped their signs to closed and hurried to the docks. Children were released early from summer programs, their excited voices hushed by parents who sensed the solemnity of the moment, without understanding its cause. From his vantage point, Edward watched in confusion. No naval exercises had been scheduled, No dignitaries were visiting. There was no reason for this display of military presence in the small tourist harbor. The lead vessel, a guided missile destroyer, docked with precision. On the deck stood Rear Admiral James Nelson, his dress whites immaculate, his face composed in formal lines. In his gloved hands, he held a perfectly folded American flag, the triangle of blue and stars displayed with ceremonial care. Edward felt a strange tightening in his chest. He knew that fold, had performed it himself many times over his years of service. It was the fold given to honor the fallen, to recognize sacrifice. Slowly, painfully aware of his stiff joints in his civilian clothes, Edward made his way down to the harbor. The crowd parted for him without knowing why, sensing something important in his deliberate progress toward the assembled naval officers. Admiral Grant Holloway spotted him and stepped forward, his salute crisp and formal. "Chief Petty Officer Hale," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent harbor, "permission to come ashore and render honors." Edward returned the salute reflexively, the motion embedded in muscle memory despite the decades of civilian life. "Permission granted, Admiral," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. The Admiral descended the gangway, followed by a formal color guard. The assembled sailors on all 6 vessels stood at attention, facing 43 years ago, Nelson began addressing the gathered crowd rather than Edward directly. This man prevented a catastrophic failure aboard the USS Constellation when a cooling system ruptured during a storm in the South China Sea. He manually sealed the compartment, sustaining severe burns to 60% of his body. His actions prevented toxic gases from reaching the sleeping quarters, where 128 sailors lay unaware of the danger. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many turned to look at Edward with new eyes, seeing for the first time the faint scars that traced his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. Chief Reynolds never spoke of his actions. He declined the Navy Cross, asking only that we take care of the boys who didn't make it home. He has lived among you for 40 years, asking nothing, expecting nothing. The Admiral's gaze swept the harbor, resting briefly on the gleaming yacht where Mercer and several others stood watching. Yesterday, his vessel, Liberty Child, was destroyed in this harbor. No assistance was offered. No respect was shown. The flag he served under was allowed to sink. A young sailor stepped forward, carrying a wooden plaque. He approached Edward and bowed his head respectfully before presenting it. Edward looked down at the polished surface. It contained a brass plate from a decommissioned ship, engraved with the words, "For the man who kept the sea safe, even after service." The United States Navy does not forget its own, Admiral Grant Holloway continued. "We have come to render honors to Chief Petty Officer Edward Hale, and to acknowledge that his service did not end when he removed his uniform." All around the harbor, sailors stood at attention, saluting. The color guard raised their flags. In that moment, it wasn't just 6 ships that had arrived. It was the full weight of naval tradition and brotherhood. Someone in the crowd began live streaming the ceremony. Within minutes, the footage was spreading across social media platforms. The hashtag #, Boomer Down, that had accompanied yesterday's video of the boat collision, rapidly gave way to Veteran Salute. Commenters who had mocked the old man just hours before, now scrambled to delete their posts, replaced by messages of respect and shame. "I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell us he was a hero? This is what real service looks like." Mercer, watching from his yacht, had the grace to look uncomfortable. His guests had fallen silent, champagne glasses set aside as the ceremony unfolded. After the formal presentation, Admiral Grant Holloway spoke privately to Edward. "We heard about what happened from your grandson. Daniel contacted the Navy Alumni Association. Why didn't you call us yourself, Chief?" Edward shrugged slightly. "Not your problem, sir. It was just a boat." "No, Reynolds, it was never just a boat, and you were never just a sailor." The Admiral looked out over the water. "Some debts can never be repaid." As the ceremony concluded, and the crowds began to disperse, a strange thing happened. One by one, townspeople approached Edward, many for the first time in years, and offered their hands, their thanks, their apologies. The harbor master presented him with fishing permits for life. The owner of the local marina offered him a slip free of charge for whatever vessel you choose. Edward accepted it all with the same quiet dignity he'd shown when his boat was destroyed. But to those who looked closely, there was a new light in his eyes. Not triumph, but recognition. After decades of silence, he had been seen. 1 week later, a small dedication ceremony was held at Edward's usual mooring spot. A simple stone marker now stood on the dock. Liberty Child, a boat that carried more than one life. The town council had approved it unanimously, with several members tearfully acknowledging they'd never known the true story of the quiet man who'd lived among them for decades. The harbor had changed in subtle but significant ways. Where tourists had once passed Edward without a glance, they now paused at the memorial, reading the plaque that briefly outlined his service record. Local fishermen, who had gradually been pushed to the margins by pleasure craft, found themselves greeted with new respect. Most surprising was the change in the children. Where they had once been kept away from the old fishermen as irrelevant relics of a bygone era, they now gathered at the docks after school, eager to hear stories and learn skills that no app could teach. On this particular afternoon, Edward sat on a newly installed bench facing his old mooring spot, demonstrating knot-tying techniques to a group of attentive children. His gnarled fingers moved with surprising dexterity, transforming simple rope into intricate patterns that had secured vessels through countless storms. "This one's called a bowline," he explained, his voice gentle. "Been saving sailors since before Columbus." A young girl named Lily, about 7 years old, watched with serious concentration as he guided her hands through the motions. "Are you angry at the man who broke your boat?" she asked suddenly, with the direct curiosity only children can manage. Edward paused, considering her question with the same care he'd given to teaching her the knot. "No," he said finally, "if not for them, perhaps no one would remember that boat ever existed." The children absorbed this with solemn nods, understanding instinctively a wisdom that many adults had missed. Later that afternoon, Edward received an unexpected visitor. Colin Mercer stood awkwardly at the edge of the dock, designer sunglasses pushed up on his head, looking distinctly uncomfortable away from his usual entourage. "Mr. Rennell," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with unfamiliar territory. "I came to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable." Edward nodded but said nothing, waiting. Mercer produced an envelope. "I want to make this right. There's a blank check in here. Whatever you think is fair compensation for your boat and for my conduct, just name the amount." Edward looked at the envelope but made no move to take it. "Money won't rebuild what was lost," he said quietly. "Then tell me what will," Mercer replied, and for the first time genuine emotion broke through his practiced charm. "I've been a complete ass and now I'm all over the internet as the guy who destroyed a hero's boat. Just tell me how to fix this." Edward considered the younger man for a long moment. "There's a spot on the eastern pier," he said finally. "It faces the sunrise. Put a bench there, a good solid one that will last. Have it carved with 3 words. Sit, remember, thank." Mercer blinked, clearly expecting a more substantial request. "That's it, just a bench?" "Sometimes," Edward said looking out over the water. "What people need most is a place to stop and remember what matters." 2 days later, a master woodworker from Seattle arrived to install a hand-carved teak bench at the precise spot Edward had indicated. The 3 words were inlaid in bronze that would develop a patina with the sea air but never fade entirely. Mercer himself came to help with the installation, working without complaint despite the blisters forming on his manicured hands. Word of Edward's response to Mercer's offer spread through the town and beyond. The story was picked up by national media. Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench instead. Commentators debated whether he had been too forgiving or profoundly wise. Veterans groups cited his example when discussing the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Edward himself avoided the renewed attention. He continued his quiet routine, now centered around teaching rather than fishing. Without Liberty Child he could no longer provide fish for the community kitchen as he had for decades, but he found he could offer something equally valuable: time, patience, and the wisdom that comes from living close to the elements. A month after the incident, Admiral Grant Holloway returned, this time without fanfare, driving a civilian car and wearing casual clothes. He found Edward at his usual spot on the dock. "The Secretary of the Navy has a proposition for you," Nelson said after they'd exchanged greetings. "There's a youth maritime program they're looking to expand, teaching seamanship, navigation, environmental stewardship. They need instructors who understand both the sea and young people." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I'm an old man, Admiral, not much use to anyone these days." Nelson laughed. "Tell that to the kids who followed you around like ducklings when I pulled up. The position's yours if you want. Part-time, flexible hours, decent stipend." Before Edward could respond, a commotion at the harbor entrance caught their attention. A small wooden boat was being towed in, newly built but with a distinctly traditional design. On its stern fresh paint gleamed Liberty's child. The entire town seemed to have gathered on the docks. Daniel stood at the helm, grinning widely,
"Surprise, Grandpa," he called. "We all pitched in. The design is based on your old plans. I found them in your shed." The Boat Builders Association donated the materials, and veterans from 4 states came to help with the construction. Edward stood speechless, his weathered face working with emotion as the vessel that so closely resembled his lost boat approached the dock. "It's not exactly the same," Daniel admitted as he secured the mooring lines. "We added some modern safety features, and the navigation system is updated, but the soul is the same. Your hands may not have built it, but your heart designed it." As Edward stepped aboard, his feet finding their balance on the gently rocking deck with the instinct of a lifetime at sea, he ran his hand along the polished wooden rail. At the bow, a new American flag snapped crisply in the breeze. "For a man who kept faith," Daniel said quietly, even when it seemed no one was watching. That evening, as sunset painted the harbor in golden crimson, Edward sat on Mercer's bench and watched the fishing boats returning with their day's catch. A young couple paused nearby, reading the 3 words carved into the wood. Their child asked what it meant. "It means," the father explained, "that we should stop sometimes and think about the people who made our lives possible." Edward smiled slightly, his gaze on the horizon where sea met sky in a seamless union of blue. In a world racing ever forward, he had become a living reminder to look back, not with nostalgia, but with respect for the foundations upon which the present is built. In the hush between the tides, the harbor whispered its own kind of justice. For all the years Edward had spent alone among waves and wind, the sea had carried his story further than any broadcast could, not with volume, but with reverence. Because some men are built like lighthouses, meant to guide silently and endure, his new vessel would sail the same waters as the old, carrying forward the same values: steadiness in storm, help freely given, quiet courage when required. He didn't ask for justice, he just picked up the torn flag and walked away. But the next morning, the sea remembered him. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where honor isn't forgotten, and silence never wins.